Hello and welcome back for another installment in our Courtroom Confidential conversation series, where we are pulling back the curtain on some of the voices and faces in true crime you've likely seen, heard, and maybe even followed for years. We're talking to creators, podcasters, YouTubers, the people who dig deep into the cases we discuss every week. But now we're turning the spotlight on the storytellers themselves, digging deep into their story to find out what influenced their journey into true crime, what fuels their passion, and the moments that have shaped their path. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter, an award-winning Los Angeles prosecutor turned criminal defense attorney with over 15 years experience navigating the criminal justice system. For this episode, please join me in welcoming former NYPD Sergeant Joe Giacalone, host of the popular YouTube channel True Crime with the Sarge. Hello, my friend. How are you?
Good, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. I know you are a busy man, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I got to tell you, Joe, we ask our subscribers, our viewers, who do you want to hear from next? We've done dozens of these interviews now, and we're always like, give us suggestions of people you want to hear from next. And your name continues to come up again and again and again. So you are definitely a fan favorite of a lot of people that subscribe to our channel. And I think that's because they know you have an interesting background, but they may not know the whole story. So I'm hoping we can get into that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Either that or I owe them a lot of money, one or the other, right? So,
They're trying to hunt you down, figure out where you're hiding. Well, let's do that then. Let's start from the very beginning, if you don't mind. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, what life was like, and kind of that journey that eventually led you into law enforcement.
I was born in Brooklyn, but I was raised out on Long Island in Nassau County, and I say the mean streets of Levittown. We had a normal house, whatever, 1,000 square foot. We grew up in, me and my brother and my
Wow.
sister. Yeah, the three, there was five of us and a dog in that house. I look back now and said I can't imagine living in 1,000 square feet with all these people. We grew up under reasonable means. I went to the local Catholic school because my mother wanted to do that. My dad was an auto mechanic. So, we had a blue collar family, and mom ended up working in the bank eventually when we were all old enough to go back to school. And, I went through my high school. I went to St. Anthony's out in South Huntington. And then upon graduation, I went to the local college, Nassau Community College, because I couldn't afford anything else. So I think it was $48 a credit. I think I paid back then. So
Wow.
you could tell.
Yeah.
And then and then I went to Hofstra University and I got my degree in banking and finance because that was something I really, wanted to do in respect that yeah, I really enjoyed like the stock markets and all those stuff. But I'm glad I did because even though I had this desire to do, public service, I had something to fall back on because, like I tell my students all the time, law enforcement is a career that chooses you. You don't really choose it because you got to go through
Yeah.
all these backgrounds, you got to do all this stuff. So you better have a fallback position. So that's what I did in regards to my schooling. But getting your college degree is still important, and I make sure that the kids still know this. That getting your 4-year degree puts you ahead of other people that don't. So that's
Would
just something.
had anyone in your family, gone to college before? I mean, did you wanna get into, like, the stock market? Was anyone in your family someone who had done that?
Yeah, my brother before me, he went to college. My sister didn't. She went right into the workplace right after high school. I mean, we're talking late 70s now, early
Yeah.
80s, and so she went right from school right into the workforce. My brother went to college. He ended up working in the stock market and doing that kind of stuff. And I was kind of following in his footsteps per se. But here's the irony of that. When we were younger, my brother and I, because he's a few years older than I am, my parents never let us play with guns. We didn't have toy guns, cap
Mm.
guns, water guns, nothing. My mother was dead against it, and he ended up joining the FBI, and I ended up joining the NYPD. So
I
I used to say to my mom, I'm like, I think your plan backfired, and she turned to me and said, well, you're not robbing banks, so I guess not. So
right.
that's just a little tidbit there.
Um, that's incredible. I did not know that about your brother. So he go into the FBI before you decided to go into law enforcement yourself? Is that what inspired you?
Well, we almost no, we almost went in almost at the same time. So what happens is, in order to get into the FBI, you need to have at least 3 years work experience after graduating college. So he went that route. He went to work in the stock market and work for a firm and that kind of thing as he was getting his 3 years of work experience before applying to the FBI. So at that point, because he's 4 years older than I am, so as I'm catching up and that kind of thing. My parents knew I was going to go into public service, but they would have bet the house that I would have been a fireman because my godfather was a fireman and he would take me into Manhattan and show me the fire engines, when I was a kid and do all that stuff. And that was something I wanted to do. But when the time came to take the test, the fire department wasn't hiring. So I
Yeah.
decided to, take the police test because at the time what they do is call lateral over. So if you work for one city agency, you can get a job, let's say as a police officer or even a sanitation worker, and then take the test for the fire department and then switch over all your time and pension and everything else into the fire department. So that was the kind of fallback plan on that. So I went into the police department. I took the test. I did well on it, and I got hired in June of 1992, where things were still going pretty bad in the city because we hadn't hit the height, I think, in homicides until 1994.
Yeah, you entered special. So this is the New York Police Department we're talking about.
Right. But at the time, there were actually three different police departments that you could get hired by when you took the test. So they had the NYPD, the
Mhm.
housing police, or the transit police. You didn't have a choice. So you went up there, everything went by like a lottery system. So you would go in there and they would say, okay, you're going to NYPD, you're going to transit, you're going to housing. So it's like everything else. If you didn't know anybody, right, there was a good possibility you were going to go to housing or transit because those were the less desirable, police departments at the time. So I had already picked I was going to go if I had to choose between housing and transit, I was going to go to housing because I didn't want to be below ground all day for the next 20 something years. So, you
What
know,
is housing? I've never heard of that.
yeah, housing just covered the housing projects,
Oh,
that kind of stuff. All throughout the city there were nine what we call PSAs, public police service areas, and they covered the vast majority of the housing developments that would fall under at this time the housing police. But eventually, all three of those became just one police department, NYPD, around 1995. I think it was 1996. They all got merged into one.
gotcha. But your plan was still do a little bit of time in the police department, wait till things open up in the fire department and lateral over. But that didn't
Right.
happen, did it?
No, it didn't happen because the sergeant's exam came up pretty fast, and I did well on it, and then I was getting promoted. So at that point, if I would have lateraled over, I would have lost that seniority and everything else that goes along with it. So at that point, it was I had 5 years, a little more than 5 years, and I was getting promoted to sergeant. So
Wow.
I had just said, well, no, this is going to be it now. Because you think about it, if you wanted to get out in 20, which was kind of the plan, you're already a quarter of the way through it at this point. Now you're a supervisor. You outranked about 85% of the department by getting promoted once. So it was a
Why
good it was a good deal.
was it just luck that you happened to get into the department during a time when they were just promoting quickly, trying to move people up?
No, what happened was we had the 1994 1995 crime bill that got passed. The Safe Streets, Safe City plan that, a lot of it always ends up in the political talk, that kind of stuff,
Right.
because a lot of people went to jail during that time. But anyway, they gave out a lot of money to cities to hire cops, and New York City got like the lion's share of that. I think they got enough money to hire 10,000 cops
Wow.
over a couple of year period. So, like for instance, when I took the police test, I took it in June of 1990, and I got hired in June 1992, which was pretty quick. Over 100,000 people took that exam. And
Wow.
I was number 9,868. I remember it was 9868 out of 100,000 people that took the exam. So I got hired pretty quick off of that. And over the next few years, they hired huge classes. So I think my class was one of the biggest, if not the biggest. I think it was might have been 3,600 people they hired that summer of June of '92, and then they hired subsequently another three or four classes after us. And it's just another trivia question. We were the 1992 class in New York City was the last class to graduate with a 38 revolver. We were the last ones that would walk out into the streets with a 38 strapped to your thigh.
That is funny. What was it like in the department at that time? And especially, I'm imagining you kind of maybe still viewing this as like a temporary career for you. What were you doing?
Well, I when we got out of the academy, it was right after Christmas in 1992, and I got sent up to the Bronx, and we got sent to what we call field training units. And the field training unit was me and 30 other cops, and they broke us up into different groups within the precinct. And then we had a training sergeant, and you generally had at least one veteran officer that would work with the training sergeant. Like you'd get somebody new or different every day, and then we would go
Mhm.
out. We would walk the foot post. I walked the foot post for probably about a year and a half, all through the winter. I questioned my reasoning for doing this a couple of times in the middle of January, standing on a street corner at 10:30 at night, wondering what in God's green earth am I doing out here? Just besides freezing. Uh, and there was this the only place that was open late that actually you could get warm was this place called Cucci Fritos. I'll never forget it. And in the window, they would have like all the pig's feet and all the different things in the window, but it was warm inside. So I would go in there, and then you stunk of fried foods like the rest of the night. So, and then you're walking around and the stray cats are following you around because they can smell they smell your clothes. So, y- you know, and let's put it this way, back in the day too, you had a lot of drug dealing, you had a lot of sex work, you had you name it was going on in the
Yeah.
streets at that time. And we worked on the street that above us was the elevated train, or the in New York we call them the L's. And so this thing would be rumbling by every few minutes. And it was actually a weird experience to be a cop out there doing this, late at night doing this, and you're by yourself. The next cop was 3 or 4 blocks away, so
Oh,
you're
you're
there by
not with a
yourself.
partner. You're not
Nope.
in a car and you're not with a partner. You're on foot, middle of the night, just walking the
on
streets.
your on your own. Yep, on your own. So
Wow.
you learn quick. You learn how to communicate. You learn how, because I wasn't the biggest guy in the world, so you learn how to talk your way out of trouble sometimes. Wait for help to arrive, or if you had to, you had to be able to handle yourself physically. So when I was younger, I used to be in great shape. Now I'm just a broken old man. But
I imagine people skills is a huge attribute for cops. A lot of the law enforcement people I know, if I'm ever, I've when I was a prosecutor, we would sometimes go out and see a crime scene or something, and the really good detectives were so friendly and comfortable with people because they knew that was kind of the most disarming way to be, is just like, hey, how you doing? People are naturally suspicious. What are you doing walking around their neighborhood? Who are these cops here? Why these guys got guns on their hips? And the guys who are just kind of naturally easy to get along with and diffusing situations are the ones that made kind of brought the temperature down for everybody. I imagine that is a skill that you had to polish in those young years.
yeah, you learn quickly, right? You learn how to, certain things can get people really upset in regards to this. And plus, we're dealing with what we refer to as EDPs for short, emotionally disturbed persons. So you're dealing with
Yeah.
not only sometimes the criminal element, you're dealing with good people having bad days, and then you're dealing with people who are not of their right mind. And you deal with
Right.
this all day long, and you have to learn that talking to each individual group requires a different set of skills. And
Wow.
certain words work with some people and some don't. And unfortunately, I was well, fortunately, I was able to talk, communicate well, and get people to do things that they normally didn't want to do. Like, I used to tell when I first retired, just to skip. I had a friend of mine who's like, "Hey, would you like to come sell cars? Do you think you could sell cars?" I'm like, "I used to sell people jails. I could sell cars, but I just don't want to."
Yeah.
That whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you learn pretty quickly how to deal with things. And my biggest problem though is my facial expressions, right? So I can hide most things, but my face could tell tales.
Gives
And
it all away.
oh yeah,
Was it
so
was it I imagine this is kind of a silly question, but was it dangerous? Did you feel like when you were out there that this was a you're in dangerous situations?
yeah, it's weird. I never really felt that way, right? So you're out there on your own, you're doing things, you become hypersensitive to a lot of things. And you learn how to read people, and you learn nonverbal body language, and you learn a lot of those things. And even to this day, now that I'm, going to be 57, I think, oh my God. Um, Yeah, I still can read people really well, and actually, I'll drive my wife crazy a couple times because we'll meet somebody, like, oh, she's like, oh, that person is. I'm like, that person's crazy. Stay away from them. And she's like, oh, come on, that's stop. And then like 2 months later, she'd be like, that person's crazy. Like, how did you know that? It's just it becomes almost innate that you can
Yeah,
read into people and be able to see like where they're coming from and that kind of thing. You'll learn how to ask the right questions and even answer the right questions. But even as you know, as lawyers, you could still trip people up, right? Because sometimes you let your guard down, even though you're a quote unquote expert at how to talk to people and do things. You could still make mistakes. So it's not
100%.
foolproof. Let's put it that way.
So you're in the department, you're walking the beat, right? You're a beat,
Hmm.
isn't that what they refer to it as? A beat
Yep.
cop, just kind of walking the streets. But then soon you told us that you get this sergeant exam, you pass that, and now you're promoted. How does that
Mhm.
change things in the department for you?
Well, even in between that, there was another huge incident that happened to me. So about 2 years in to doing this stuff. So like as things started loosening up, you started to getting access to patrol cars. And then
Wow.
it was yeah, so about it was September 1994, we get sent to a disorderly group of youth in a warehouse, and we ended up walking into an armed robbery of a cable vision warehouse. At the time, they were stealing the boxes. You remember the old boxes?
Oh yeah.
They were stealing them. They were putting them in there, and we walked into this. They had people tied up, and the next thing you know, gunshots. We went off. We went into about a 7-minute gunfight
Oh my
with
God.
these five guys. Nobody got hit. We didn't shoot anybody. They didn't shoot us, but well, bullet holes everywhere, kind of thing. And wait till the cavalry arrived, and then and it was just like one of those defining moments because believe it or not, most cops who do get involved in an on-duty shooting, it happens early on in their careers. If you take a look at even some of the incidents that have happened recently, it happens within like the first 5 years because the smarter cops, I would say, learn to get off patrol and go do something else because
Right.
patrol is where you're just running into all kinds of crazy stuff all day long. I mean, maybe that might not be the reason why it happens, but I think that's probably one of the biggest things is why young cops get into so many shootings is because you're on patrol. You're dealing with that radio calling you every 5 minutes.
They're
So
on the front lines. Makes
yeah.
sense. So
So
what happens after the shooting?
like everything else, that was my first real taste of lineups. Going through lineups, not only as from the police point, but now as like the quote unquote victim kind of thing.
Right.
So
Right.
picking these guys out of a line. So I start to get into the different aspects of things, not knowing exactly where my career was going to take me. I look back on it and say, this was just another learning experience. And dealing with that's when we go to trial, we go to have to testify. I- you know it was stressful doing all that time, but you know what though, I look back on it, it was I'm glad it happened in that respect because you kind of got all these things out of the way. You learn how, like I said, well, lineups, you learn how to testify, you learn how to deal with defense attorneys and the questions and how to answer them and what to do. So it was actually a unique experience. I mean, I ended up testifying on other cases, but you being the sole complainant, so to speak, was interesting.
Did that give you a taste for perhaps getting involved in some other aspect of the department?
Well, like everything else, a lot of people, including myself at the time, wanted to get into the detective bureau. I wanted to get into that investigations part of things. And I was reading books and doing, try to go to training, but as a young cop, they're not sending you to this training because they're going to send, detectives who are already in that. So you end up doing things either on your own time or trying to learn. And I remember early on, it was ironic because one of the first books I read about these things was Mindhunter, which by John
Mhm.
Douglas, learning about the
Mhm.
serial killer. And then all of a sudden that book rearing its ugly head with the Rex Sherman case out on Long Island. So that was actually kind of interesting. But so I got promoted to sergeant, and at the time, like everything else, they gave you 15 choices. So at the time, there was 75 precincts. So you allowed to pick. You had 15 choices that you can go to, and I got my 16th choice. Uh, so yeah, so it was funny because one of the sergeants that I had when I was a cop. he nicknamed me Black Cloud because like everywhere I went, there always something happened. And um,
And these are
yeah,
choices of where you're gonna be assigned then?
yeah. So you have yes, you had choices. And they say you know you could pick 15 places. So I'm like, I 15 out of 75. I mean, somebody do the math quick, right? You're looking at
Right.
there's a good possibility you're going to get something. Not me, you know. I ended up going to the 7-3 precinct in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is a 1 square mile precinct with about 80 to 90 homicides a year.
Wow.
And
I did
yes,
not
so
know they break it up that small. So you're saying one precinct can handle an area only 1 square mile big?
yeah, there's a couple. There's the 7-3 in Brooklyn, the 4-6 up in the Bronx. I think is about a mile or a mile and a half, maybe square mile total.
Wow.
And 4-6 back in the day was a bad precinct in regards to violent crime. Some of these precincts now, it's ironic, like we had up in Washington Heights, the 3-4, that she ended up breaking it up. It used to be a very violent, drug infested neighborhoods. Now they have cupcake stores on the corner, and people walking around with man buns and everything else that's going on. Uh,
Yoga mats.
yeah, as the urban pioneers, as we used to refer to them as, they're coming in from all over the place, moving into this, and you're just kind of shaking your head going, because people have no idea how bad things used to be.
That's
And
incredible.
but you know what? Looking back again, I was glad I went to a busy place like that because learning how to be a sergeant is a total different ballgame, right?
Yeah,
The
what
supervisory
is
role.
that? What does that mean? I mean, we hear that term tossed around a lot, but what does that mean now that you're a sergeant?
Well, you're not one of the guys anymore. You're the enemy basically. Because you're the one that's got to go down there and make sure everyone's doing their job. And when I first got promoted, I remember there was one sergeant that was he had about I guess he was a sergeant about 3 or 4 years before me, and he was at the precinct, and he told me the one thing that I actually kept with me, and he said, just remember one thing: it's not your job to do it anymore. It's your job to make sure it gets done, and it gets done right. And that was the lesson that he gave me, and it kind of stuck with me because we see this in all walks of life, right? Where somebody becomes a supervisor, and all of a sudden, because they know maybe a little bit more than the person underneath, they start doing it, right, or micromanaging or whatever it may be, and that becomes an issue. So, so you get a platoon, you work the desk or you work patrol, you kind of, field patrol. So you kind of, it depends on who's working. If the lieutenant's working, he or she would dictate to you, like, as the sergeant, you got the desk, which nobody ever wanted because the desk was, I mean, if you wanted to create a movie about like craziness, going on in a precinct, I mean, that place would have been it. The kids are in there banging basketballs off the walls and narcotics bringing in 20 bodies at one time. It was just non-stop nuttiness. And you're running the desk and you're answering the phones, you're checking on the evidence, you got people yelling at you, you got all kinds of people want to make complaints, and you're just it's just one thing after another. But you learn how to multitask, and you learn how to you know do things. Yeah, it's weird kind of thing that you how you learn how to do things.
When you say running the desk, I'm imagining like, out of the movies, whenever we see a busy New York police station precinct, the guy that literally like they're bringing in the guys and they're handing it to some guy
Yep.
sitting behind a desk who's like checking everybody in. Is that literally how it works?
Just like the movies, these big desks, and you're like 3 feet above everybody
Yeah.
else, and you're looking down at everything and everybody, and you're sitting at the desk, and you have all of these things going at you. And we would have things were so busy that we would have a either an officer on light duty or something like that to be your assistant because there's just so many things going on where
Incredible.
the phone's ringing, the captain wants this, you got, like I said, narcotics would come in with 20 bodies, and there's drugs and things all over the place, and there's vouchers to be signed out and sent in, and you have to check all the evidence, and you have to do. That's why when I watch some of these cases that are going on, and I'm listening to things, and I'm just going crazy because you sit there, my God, if I did my job like that, I'd been walking a footpost on the Brooklyn Bridge in the middle of January. And, you know, it should be, and so you learn really quick in a busy, busy place. That's why I tell my students too, like, they're like, oh, I want to go here, I want to go there. I'm like, go to the worst place you can think of because you learn you could do
Yeah,
everything. So
right.
I learned how to, handle crime scenes, and we would do in Brownsville, we were doing them every day. You were on patrol, you had a
Wow.
shooting every day or a stabbing or something.
Wow.
So you learn how to. secure the scene, watch hold on to witnesses and do all those kind of things. That's why when I watch things that transpire in some of these big cases, and you just kind of shake your head, and I just said, where's the supervisor on this? Like,
Yeah.
why is this person still walking around? How come the witnesses are talking to one another? How come there's nobody watching the crime scene? All the different things that go on, because that's all you need these days, and you lose your case.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us though, what's the next step? I know eventually you make yourself into, I don't know whether or not you call it becoming a detective or part of a detective squad or something. How does that transpire?
Well, what happened is, because I was already a sergeant, right? So I had already skipped the detective rank. So,
Gotcha.
so after, I spent I think almost 5 years or 4.5 years working in Brooklyn, and I had kind of had enough already. I was like burnt out. I'm like, I had enough. And you go in front of what they call the board, and the board is, you speak to a captain from patrol, a captain from the detective bureau, a captain from internal affairs, and and at the time we had OCCB, Organized Crime Control Board, that has like narcotics and gangs, which I didn't want to do. I didn't want to get involved in that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
because it's just like jumping out of the fire into the frying pan.
Right. Right.
So I didn't want to, and things were still going crazy, because we're talking about probably around 2004, I think it was. Um, you don't realize it, but you're talking over 20 years ago now. So you're trying to remember like all these dates and stuff. But anyway, so you go in front of the board, and internal affairs always has the first crack at you. So, of course, I didn't want to go to internal affairs, but I knew there was a good possibility of going. And so they go and they ask you questions like, would you like to do this? Would you want to do that? And of course, the patrol captain, he's going to want to try to keep you. So, and I'll never forget it. I don't remember the captain's name from patrol, but he asked me. So he goes, "I only have one question." He goes, "Why do you want to leave such a beautiful place like Brooklyn?" That was it. So I'm like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Is that a rhetorical question?" He's like, "Yeah, I don't want an answer. I'm not asking any more questions." So I ended up going to internal affairs. So internal affairs picked me, and I had to go there for 2 years. And you learn how to be an investigator there. So I was doing cases that people complain about, police misconduct, corruption, you name it. And when I was there, I really didn't see too many like really big cases. Little things here and there. Cops get into bar fights, those kind of things. Which is, I always tell, new cops, just stay away from the bars when you're young, especially on probation, because all you need to do is get into one fight and your career is finished.
Wow.
And I saw that a couple times happen. And then you end up, you get yourself in trouble pretty easily when you're doing stuff like that. So I was just stay away from that, and try to go there. And then after that was over, you get a chance to pick, where you want to go. It's like it's an automatic. So when my time was up.
Oh, so it's like they want you for the couple of years, and then you serve your time, you get to pick where else you go. I'm curious though, um, maybe this is just in the movies, but it always seems like internal affairs has this kind of like bad rap, like, oh, it's the internal affairs guys. They're the ones who are investigating us. They're they're
No,
not part
it's
of the team or something. Does it
oh, it's
have a
just like
feeling
that.
like that?
Yeah,
It
it's
is
just like
really
that. Yeah, and it doesn't matter even if you're, because we refer to yourself, you get drafted. I mean, I got drafted. I didn't choose to go there,
right,
so it kind of
right,
makes it a little less. But nobody trusts you. Nobody wants to, uh, because they think that you're. The term used in the police department is you're a rat, right? So you're a
right,
rat. So
right.
here comes the rat squad, that kind of thing. And so you just let the water roll off your back like a duck.
Sure,
It is what it is. It's just something that you have to go through. But I did learn, building cases, presented them to the district attorney, that kind of stuff, going through that whole thing. Which, in hindsight, it was a pretty good experience learning how to do all those things. And then, when my time came up, they said, "Okay, where do you want to go?" So I said, I want to go to the detective bureau. So I
gotcha,
went to the detective bureau, and my first day there, I got transferred 3 times before I finally got to the place I wanted. Before I got to a precinct, because like everything else, I didn't know anybody. So anybody with a phone call would make their phone call. So I went to one precinct, and I got there like, hey, I'm the new XO, new executive officer. How you doing? This that, and the phone call, the phone would ring, and then the lieutenant be like, okay, you've just been transferred to this precinct. So I get in
What
my
for?
car
Why were they transferring you?
because other people who had a hook would call up and say, I want to go to that precinct. This guy's new.
Okay,
So
gotcha,
because now
gotcha.
you don't have any, even,
Politics.
yeah, politics at play, right? So we call them rabbis. You call your rabbi, and your rabbi would call up and say, send Joe Smith there, send this guy somewhere else. So I go to the next precinct. And I go in there, I walk in, I introduce myself, and the phone rings again. Like, send this guy. So I'm like, I'm not going anywhere until you tell me where I'm going.
You guys figure this all out and
This
then
is,
let me know.
yeah, I got transferred, I think it was 3 times in one day. So I finally ended up in the 110 precinct in Queens, which is Corona, which was at the time where Shea Stadium is, the old
Mm.
World's Fair and that kind of stuff, which was good because I was a big Mets fan. So we had a couple of cases with the Mets, the things that had happened over there. So actually that was kind of interesting. But I was the executive officer, which was nice because you had a lieutenant and there were two sergeants, and the other sergeant was charge of the burglary robbery team, and I was in charge of the squad, the executive, the second in command, basically. But I'm new. I still don't know anything, right? So you have to learn. And
I'm
then of
glad you
course,
mentioned that because I've been meaning to ask you that important question about whether or not you're a Mets or a Yankees fan, but you're saying you're a Mets fan.
oh yeah, I
Okay.
had to be because my brother was a Mets fan. So under the penalty of death.
Okay. Because I'm a Dodgers fan, and so I was hoping that we could get along, but after that last World Series, but it sounds like we might even be meeting each other in the playoffs anyways.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, listen. Well, the Dodgers were originally from Brooklyn, right? So there's always
That's
that
true.
that tie in there. Most people still, most people don't know that the Dodgers have been playing in L.A. longer than they ever played in Brooklyn. But there's kids out there that don't realize that the Dodgers come from Brooklyn.
Yep, very true. All right, so now you're a detective. You're at the assignment well, not necessarily the assignment you wanted to be at, but you're at the assignment and that you're a
Mhm.
detective. You've landed in a precinct. How long are you in? Well, I don't want to skip over steps that you take along the way, but how long are you in the department altogether?
At that point, I was probably 15 years almost
Wow.
at that
Wow.
going on, and I was a sergeant for a long time. And what happened was, even though I didn't have quote unquote seniority in regards to to get a pick of where you want to go because there were other sergeants in the detective bureau, but I got promoted in January of 1999. So I had a lot of time on. So I knocked out like probably 10 people for vacation picks because
Gotcha.
yeah, because that's how it works with the sergeants. It goes by the not the time you got hired, but the time you got promoted.
Gotcha.
So I went in there to the detective bureau with a lot of time as a sergeant under my belt, which is kind of unusual because you usually go pretty quick. I mean, I lost 2 years plus, went through internal affairs while other people got lucky enough. Maybe they had a phone call or what have you, and just went straight into the detective bureau. So I find myself as a sergeant in the detective bureau, and learning then again. But here's where the experience of being a sergeant, a patrol sergeant in a busy precinct, learning about how to handle the crime scenes and doing all that stuff. But a new layer of things on there now. So now I have to run those crime scenes. So learning how to know where your people are at all times, making sure you don't cross contaminate crime scenes, right? Make sure you don't send the two detectives that are at the crime scene and then you find, the vehicle that was used in the crime and not sending those same two detectives over there because now you're cross contaminating your crime scene. Learning about sending detectives to the hospital right away to make sure that if you had a shooting or something like that to try to get a statement if the guy's likely to die. So all these things you have to learn how to do these at the basically the split second. And then the unique part of this was on the weekends because everybody's short staffed. The sergeants would get what's called the duty. So I would cover an entire borough of.
Wow.
Right. So I mean, my wife knew that when I would have the duty either on a Saturday or Sunday, I wasn't coming home because you have like 8, 9 precincts that you cover, and something's going to happen. And there's someone's going to get shot, something's going to happen, and you're going to be working, all day and all night. And 9 times out of 10, that was the case. Yeah, and it
So
always happened like 10 minutes before you had to go home.
So the way you're explaining it, I almost see the sergeant as almost like the director on a film or something that you get a crime scene, you roll out there and you're kind of just telling people what to do and making sure they get it done right, but not necessarily, the one making the interviews or picking up the evidence. Is that how it
That's
generally goes?
exactly, yeah. So that was not even to cross contaminate our show here, but that was one of my big complaints that happened in Canton, where you have a lieutenant actually actively looking for evidence with his snow blower, with his leaf blower and everything like that.
Yeah.
That never happens. Chain of custody, you learn really quick, is really important. The person who found it is the person who documents it. We have a crime scene unit that would come and photograph it 3 different times, in place, in situ, with a ruler, without the ruler, a small, close up, medium, long view. So, you learn all these things really quickly. And I was always the type of person that would ask questions because I didn't know. So if I had the sergeant from crime scene there, I'd be like, okay, man, what are we doing here? Tell me how
Right.
this works. And now, not that I was going to ever work in crime scene, but crime scene's not always available sometimes when you're doing these things. So you got to know, like, what happens if we're going to have a snowstorm and I got shell casings, or what happens if it's going to be a rainstorm, or and there's the possibility that the blood and from the thing is going to get washed down into the gutter or something like that. So you learn, how to handle some of these things. And sometimes you need it, and sometimes you don't. And I came from the school where I'm better off having it, not needing it, than needing it, not having it. So I learned a lot from people who were there before me, and that was one thing. Most of the people I spoke to, either old time detectives, where you would have 40-year detectives in there, would be if you were willing to listen, they were willing to talk,
Yeah.
and because
At,
you can't replace that kind of experience.
no, no. You can't learn it out of a book either.
No.
At what point do you start to think about leaving the department, about retiring, about a life outside of the police department?
Um, Well, I had always thought of doing the police department for 20 years and then doing something else like teaching or something else. I always had a plan, right? So I already had my 4-year degree, which at the time you didn't need college credits to get into the police department. When I got hired, all you needed was a GED. That was it. You didn't even
Mhm.
need a high school diploma. So you would get this GED in place of the high school diploma. So by having the 4-year degree already, I was already like leaps and bounds above everybody else in regards to promotions and all these other things, because they'd have to now go back to school and do all these other things. And I think that's why I kind of did well the first time around, because there were so many people trying to get their 64 college credits in order to even take the sergeant's exam. So you're working, you're going to school, you're doing all, and then you're trying to study. And if you have a family, none of that works. So I think I kind of fell into a good spot there. But I think I used to joke around. The only two people that know how much time they have left are cops and inmates. Those are the only two people that know how much they have it down to the minute. And here's the thing for your listeners, right? If you have a friend that's a police officer or whatever, ask them the question, "Hey, how much time do you have in the police department?" They will never answer like, "Oh, I've been a cop now for 7 years." They'll say, "I have 13 years left."
Yeah. 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 What was the how long you were looking for your 20-year mark? Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, yeah. It would also
Yeah.
depend on where I was and what I was doing. So uh, after working in the squad for a while, because and here's where now having that degree, and I started teaching at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I went for the master's program, so I was relatively new to the department at that point, where you have supervisors with patrol experience, with detective bureau experience, and now at master's degrees. My problem comes into the training unit had a big problem. They failed the state for the accreditation, and they did all the other stuff. So unfortunately for me at the time, my name came up on a short list of somebody who had the experience and the degree to get this off the ground. So the chief at the time had called up and said, "Hey Joe, this is chief, our training unit. We have the thing. I'd like you to go, come do this, whatever this." And I'm like, "Thanks, chief. I'm really not interested. I like doing what I'm doing." He goes, "Good. We'll see you on Monday." And
I get the impression there's a lot of that going around. It sounds
yeah,
like most of your time there, you're just kind of being told where to go.
Yes, and that's why I tell people, if you don't have a rabbi, if you don't have, this is the things that happen to you, right? So if you have nobody
Yeah.
in your corner that's saying like, oh, I got a special place for you, or we're gonna, protect you from going here, or we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. Because I was the first police officer in my family, and that was, bottom line, and we didn't know anybody, so I kind of had to make my own way in regards to that. But you know what, good soldier, doing what I do. I showed up in Brooklyn once again. Here I am back in Brooklyn, to get this training together, it took me a while, but we wrote a couple of different courses. We got the homicide course accredited. We wrote a basic investigation course. We revamped the regular investigations course. We put out an interview interrogation course. So once again, now learning through all the different things, bringing in experts, getting this on paper, learning how to write courses and get them accredited, was this something else I added to my resume list, so to speak. So
Yeah.
after I think it was about 2 years or so doing that, I kind of went to the chief and said, okay, I did what you asked me to do. I got all this stuff done. We got the accreditation, everything. The last class is done. I want to go do something else. And he says, you know what? You're right. You did what you wanted to do. So tell me where you wanted to go. So I said, I want to go to cold case. He said,
Oh,
good.
wow.
So he said, good. Tomorrow, Monday morning, report to, Brooklyn again, because that's where the main office for cold case was. Report to the lieutenant, and the paperwork will follow. Just show up there Monday. And if the lieutenant has a problem, just tell him to call me. So,
Wow.
and that's what it is. So the lieutenant, so they had, so, if, for those that don't know, there are 5 counties, or which we call boroughs in New York City. New York County, which is Manhattan; Kings County, which is Brooklyn; we have Queens; we have the Bronx, or the Bronx. If you come from the Bronx, they can't say the, so it's the Bronx. And then we have yeah, Staten Italian, or which is really Richmond County. So for those trivia experts, that's where
Yeah,
that's
I
those are the
know.
5 counties that make up New
There
York
will
City.
be a
So
test at the end of this, everybody.
yes, there will be a test. And so we had a sergeant in Queens. We had the lieutenant in Brooklyn, which covered Brooklyn and basically Staten Island and Manhattan. So I ended up going back to the Bronx where I started. But it was nice because I got my own title, so I was the commanding officer of the Bronx Cold Case Squad. At the time when I
What
got there was me. I'm sorry, was it?
No, I'm sorry. What drew you to Cold Case? Why you it sounds like you knew that in your head that was someplace you wanted to end up. What about it attracted you?
Yeah, they talk about the most challenging type of investigations you have, right? So if there's a
Yeah.
reason why those cases were still open, uh, if they haven't solved them before. So to me, I took it as a giant, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, it's a huge puzzle that you look and try to figure out exactly what happened here, right? So to me, it was the ultimate investigations, and I wanted to be part of that because the victims still searching for justice, their families were still looking for things, and some sort of what we sometimes people call it closure, whatever makes the families feel better. So I thought that this would be a place that I definitely would want to go, because I think there was a lot of work that still needed to be done in that area. So when I got there, there were 4 detectives in the Bronx and myself when I first got there. And then one of the other detectives, he got promoted pretty quickly, and they never replaced him. And it was just me and 3 detectives. But I'll tell you something: the 3 detectives I work with, my God, these guys. One had, 2 of them were over 30 years, and the other one had like 27 years on there, whatever. But you know what? If something ever happened to you, you'd want these guys on your case, because the dogged determination, that never give up, bulldog kind of mentality. These guys were it. As a matter of fact, the one guy, Mark Tebbins, who has since passed away, they wrote books about him. The Wild Cowboys was a book. If your listeners are interested in reading a true crime book, The Wild Cowboys was about the Dominican drug gangs up in Washington Heights, and basically one guy took them all down, and that guy was Mark Tebbins, and
Wow.
he went into cold case. He was the first grade detective, which is a detective with lieutenant's pay. So it's a 2 scale jump, and but these guys were unbelievable, and we had some really good cases that we built while we were there. And there's a couple of cases like everywhere else that you wish you could have solved while you were there, and and at least one of them I still follow pretty closely. Like everything else, Josh, you kind of know who the killer was. It's just that
Yeah.
the case was just missing the evidence to do it. And
No.
we used to affectionately call the Bronx District Attorney's Office the People's Republic of the Bronx, because trying to get anything close, trying to get a probable cause affidavit from them, it was like, trying to pull a needle out of a haystack. It was absolutely insane.
Wow. How long were you there at Cold Case?
Yeah, so up until almost till I retired, I got promoted there. I got the SDS designation, which is Supervisor Detective Squad, which is the sergeant with the lieutenant's pay. So we had some really good cases, and I got recognized for that. Plus, I also think there was some carryover that I had helped the chief out with his project too. So
Mhm.
it wasn't because I was like this great big shining star, right? But I was a good soldier who did what was expected, and got rewarded for it in the end. And as so, what happened is that chief then retired, and we got a new chief. And all of a sudden, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, we need help revamping this. You did such a good job revamping. Now we need you to come to Crime Stoppers and redo that." And I'm like, "No, thanks. I'm not doing that. I'm happy where I am." And I knew, and I told my wife, I said, "Listen, if I get transferred again, I said I'm done. I'm not staying." I
Yeah.
said, I'll do a little bit, try to get things back up, but I'm leaving." And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I got transferred. They made me the commanding officer of Crime Stoppers. They had some, listen, Crime Stoppers is a really important job. It's the anonymous tips that come in, and then because I knew just about everybody, so it was kind of easy. We'd make phone calls and say, "Hey, Bob, I got this. I got this tip from this case." That kind of thing was easy. So, but I did it for a few months, and then I put my papers in to retire because it was just something I
Wow.
didn't want to do anymore.
How
And
many years were you in at this point?
oh, I had my time was up. So I had my
Yeah.
almost was 20. Yeah, so I had about a year on the books too. So I could have left even way before that. So I had, I knew I was done. And this, I'm not naming names, but the new boss was not like the old boss. Let's put it that
Gotcha.
way. The
Gotcha.
old boss was he was a Vietnam vet, old school detective. I mean, going through that kind of stuff. And the new guy was the new and improved. And even though I wasn't old per se, I was still old school, molded in that old school, and I didn't fit into the new school.
Gotcha.
I was like, the square peg in the round hole because you get kind of that snark, you get that kind of, you talk back to people that you really shouldn't talk back to because at that point you really just didn't care. So I was the kind of guy, and this story gets told a lot, is in respect of, some of the detectives that were there. I walked in one day, and the lieutenant had the book, and I had asked anybody, I said, "Anybody have a piece of gum or piece of candy?" And the lieutenant goes like this to me. So okay, great. So I walk over there, and he starts like complaining. "You got to do this. You got to do it." So after about 30 seconds into his tirade, I said, "You don't have any candy, do you?" Just, that was at the point that I was at.
Yeah.
And everybody just stopped and laughed, and he got mad at me, threw me out. This, and I'm like, I don't care anymore.
Yeah. You were
Um,
done.
yeah, I was pretty much fried. And but I had a good career. I wasn't going to complain, but I was already teaching too. So I was teaching at John Jay. I was in the midst of writing a textbook, so I had all these different things going on. And of course, the wife was not happy that I was planning on retiring. Uh, because you lose the overtime that I was making. I was making overtime. I mean, I was at the top pay, as I
Sure.
was getting
Sure.
lieutenant's pay. I mean, I was making good money, but it wasn't worth my health,
Yeah.
and your mental health to boot, because you're just like, I dreaded getting up in the morning to go to work. And that was like the first time that I actually said, because I had to go to one police plaza to work, which is headquarters, which is something I try to avoid for almost my entire career. It was a place
Mm.
that you never even wanted to go visit.
Mm.
It's just, we used to call it Puzzle Palace. And it's just like, you always get a bad vibe when you went there. And I ended up I still have to take the train to Manhattan, and I got to take the subway, and then I got to, people are
You were done.
checking up on you every 2 seconds. I'm like, I'm not used to this. I don't want to be bothered. I don't want, people with the microscopes out looking at you. "Oh, you signed in at, 8:01. You were supposed to sign in at 8 o'clock. You know what? I got two words for you. They're not happy birthday, at this point."
So Okay, so you figure it's time. All the signs are pointing towards this. You put in your papers, but you had already mentioned this a couple of times that you're starting to work as a professor. So tell us what that involved. You said you were working on some books. Tell us about the books that you worked on. You did not just decide to go fishing. You already had some other stuff you were already working on right after your work in the department.
Right. I was planning this out now as I was going along. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I had really liked that the investigative stuff, and responding to the homicides, and we had kidnappings and um, essays and you name it. I know there's certain words that they get very nuts in here, so I
Gotcha.
won't say them. Yeah. So
Appreciate
you
that.
deal with you deal with the essays, and you deal with all those missing persons and everything else, because unlike television or unlike other police departments, like we have a homicide squad and we have a missing person squad and we have an SA squad, but the detective squads are the ones that catch all the cases initially, and
Mm,
then yeah, if it meets certain criteria, then it would go to missing persons or go to the SA squad. But homicide squads in New York City don't catch the homicides. They're only a supplementary group. They help you with your investigation. So all of the homicides in New York City stay with and are investigated by the detective squads,
oh,
which is
interesting.
yeah, which is unlike many big departments where they have their own units that
Yeah.
just, so if if a body drops, they go out and do it, and the local cops or the detectives there, whatever, they go on to doing something else because now they have the homicide squad. But in New York City, it was all us. So you learned all this stuff, and like I said, and being having the duty and having all those precincts and stuff that you have to do, so you would run into multiple homicides sometimes in a day. And I
Wow.
think I had three in one day was the most I had in one time. So you're just running like a chicken without a head. But anyway, getting back to this. So my last day I retired. So I retired on Halloween during the storm of the century, which kind of summed up my whole career. I said was, so we had Hurricane Sandy, which was, and my last day was October 31st, 2012.
Wow.
And yeah, so no power, no nothing for 5 days after that. Uh, and what happened was, so I was, like I said, I was already teaching. I was, going into school 2 days a week, and I had written a textbook about criminal investigations, about all the things I had learned and experienced, and I wrote it into a guide because as I was teaching at school, I was teaching the investigations class, and all the textbooks I'm using were just like too, for lack of a better adjective, like too textbooky, right? I mean, they never really taught you how to solve a case. It was always like, really tangential stuff. So I said, and I used to complain about it. So the guys the other professors would say, well, stop complaining about it and just write your own book.
I
So
love
I'm like,
that.
all right, challenge accepted. So I wrote my own book, but now is to get it published. That's the hard thing, right? So I said, all right, now, so I wrote the book, and then I started doing my research on how to get a book published, how to do this, how to do that, because self-publishing in colleges don't go, right? They won't use a self-published book, 99% of the time. So it has to be traditionally published. So I knew if I wanted to use it for schools, I would have to get it traditionally published. So there was a small publisher out of Queens called Loose Leaf Law who only dealt with police books. They do the code books, like the penal law books
Hmm.
and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And it was pretty much, yeah, New York. So anyway, so I read their directions and I asked people, say, how did you do it? You read the directions that they tell you, right? So if they tell you to write a cover letter, if they tell you to, whatever it is, you do it.
Yeah.
So I sent it to them, and then it said within 5 days of receipt, call them up. I said, all right. So I waited 5 days. I called up and I ended up speaking to the head publisher there. Her name was Mary, and I said, "How you doing?" I told her who I was, and instead she said, "Okay, I have 5 books on my desk. We're only going to publish one of them, and one of them is yours. You have 30 seconds to convince me to
Oh,
publish your
wow.
book."
I love this.
So I guess I gave the best elevator speech that you could give. So
Yeah.
even though I wasn't ready for that, because it didn't say in the instructions, have an elevator speech ready because you're gonna have 30 seconds to do this.
Right.
I launched into, because like I said, once again, here's your training comes back. All the different things that you do. Thinking on the fly. So I gave a thing, and she says, "Okay, we're gonna publish your book."
I love that.
Uh,
On
so
the
they
phone
published
with
it
you. Says
on the phone.
great job. We're publishing it.
Yep.
That's
So
incredible.
she said we're going to do it. So we published the book. So the book came out, and
What
I
was
got
the name of
lucky.
the book?
It's called The Criminal Investigative Function: A Guide for New Investigators. Which, by the way, now we're in the fourth edition.
Wow.
So yeah, this has been going on for a better part of 13 years now.
Incredible.
And
Congratulations. That's very cool.
thanks. Well, here's the other kicker too. I get a phone call from the publisher about 6 months into this and says, "I know, are you sitting down?" I'm like, "Okay, what?" New Jersey just adopted your book for their police promotional exams.
Love it.
So yeah, so then things just started flowing for there. So I'm like, wow, I can get used to this. So I was making, people like, oh, you must be rich, right? Yeah, I was making minimum wage, yeah, selling books. I mean, listen, you're not getting, unless you're selling, 50 million copies, you're not getting rich. And
Right.
but it was exciting, right? So it was some, I guess, validation that you wrote something that police departments were finding. So it started popping up different parts of the country, which then led to the second edition, of course, because now because now everybody wants changes. They want, oh, I want you to write a chapter on this, and we need, if you want to continue using it, we need a chapter on that. So the book started growing.
New technologies
Yep,
and things
new
like that. That
technology, right? So the original book I think was 180 pages, and then I think the second edition was like 240 pages, and now I think we're up to 400 and something pages.
incredible.
So yeah, because every time something comes up that's new or changes in the law and that kind of stuff. So of course we have to put, disclaimers everywhere saying, as of the writing of this book, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided this, right? Because you don't want somebody reading it 6 months after
Sure.
you can't update a book, as you know, with legal stuff every 5 minutes, because that's basically
Right.
how sometimes these things can change.
Sure.
So it's been through four iterations in the last 13 years.
That's
And
incredible.
then
And is this the book that you were using to teach?
So then I started using it to teach. Yeah, as soon as
Wow.
getting it approved and that kind of stuff, and then other colleges started using it to teach. So at one point, I think we had like 8 sections that we were using it in to teach, and then other colleges. I mean, throughout the country, I was getting emails from professors. Oh, I adopted your book. Do you have? So then what I did was, like everything else. All right, how do I get other? Because listen, teachers are just like everybody else. We're lazy. Right? I don't want to do more work. If I have to
Right.
change a book, right? So if you give me a new class, I gotta buy the book. I gotta not buy the book. I gotta get the book. I gotta read it. I gotta do lesson plans. I gotta write test questions. And if you think I'm doing this again,
Right.
even though I know you, right? You'd have people that know you, like Joe. I'd love to help you out, but I ain't doing this work again. So I said, okay. How about if I do it for you? So I called up the publisher and I said, listen, if we want mass adoptions from colleges across the country, we need to put out a supplementary to this. I said, I'll do all the work, but you're going to have to pay, for that. And they said, fine. So I did the complete thing of lesson plans. So we did the complete thing of PowerPoint presentations, and we gave them a test bank. So,
Love it.
so yeah, even though it was a lot of work, now all of a sudden you hand over this to somebody and say, "Would you adopt the book?" Well, no, not really. Well, here's the PowerPoints. Here's your test
Here,
questions,
I
and
just
here's your
did all your
syllabus.
work for you. Yeah.
Right. Oh, you know what? I think I will use it. So, so
That sounds
that's
like a
that.
brilliant idea.
So, and I tell people, they say, "Oh, you're lucky." I'm like, "Yeah, real lucky." It was a lot of work and sometimes forethought into how to do these things. So, if you can make something easier for somebody, they'll do it.
How
And
long how
uh,
long have you been a professor now teaching?
I spent over 20 years at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City.
Wow.
So
That's
yeah, I
incredible.
was doing this for a long time,
Are you still
and
there?
well, just from teaching online now. Yeah, I've transitioned out, kind of going through the motions at this point because, like I said, I'm getting old now. And during the when the pandemic hit, like I'm not the type of person that sits around the house. So I was driving everybody crazy in the house because I just couldn't, you don't go out, you're gonna die. I'm like, I'm gonna die anyway. What the hell's the difference? Everyone's afraid like we're gonna die. Like, yeah, hello, we're all gonna die. Um, maybe just not today. But so I said to my wife, I'm going crazy. I got to do something. Okay. So she goes, well, just go write another book. So I said, okay. So I went in my office and I made the bare bones of the cold case handbook. I said, what else? So I looked, I said, I did some research. I said, what's missing out in the real world? And I said, I could use my experience in cold case, which is unique as part of an
Yeah,
investigation. And I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make this book not only for law enforcement, but I'm going to make it for members of the media. And I'm going to mention, I'm going to write it for the victims and their families. So I'm going to break this book up into three different segments. So one for law enforcement, one for how the media could do things, and then one for the like a resource kind of guide for the families. And I called up the publisher and I said, "Hey, are you interested in, in another book?" So like, send us the proposal. And I sent us the proposal, and the next day they called me up and said, "Let's do it." So
wow,
I said, "Okay." And then I wrote the first edition of the Cold Case Handbook, and I started now using my contacts. So I was teaching for Dr. Henry Lee up in New Haven
sure,
University up there, and I got to be really friendly with Dr. Lee, and I asked him to write the forward for the book and everything else. So that was on the front cover, the whole 9 yards. And I started reaching out to, and I said, this is going to be a little different than the first book. And I started reaching out to all other kind of experts. I had reached out to Othram and Dave Matillman, Dr. Matillman, that runs Othram now, which is basically solving all our missing persons, unidentified persons cases. And he gave me a long interview, and I included that in the book. So I interviewed detectives and cops from cold case units from all over the country, trying to get the best practices put together and get it all into one area. And then I started reaching out to advocate groups like Project Cold Case down in Florida and a couple others. And I started picking everybody's brains saying, what's the number one complaint from families? What can the families do? So I started putting and organizing all this information together, and the book sold really well. As a matter of fact, the book was out, the first edition was out only a year, and we were doing the second edition already. So the second edition
wow,
is out. And I am now in the process of writing a course for Penn State to do a cold case class. So
incredible.
this could be huge because,
Uh,
as you know, they have annexes all across the country. For Penn State and that kind of stuff. So it'll be big if I can get that in there. We can get this done. Plus, the idea is to get the students immersed into an investigative mindset, learn how to solve these cases, learn how to do research on the computer and the internet and social media, teach them how to do all that stuff, and then apply it to real life cases that are happening in their neighborhoods. And we're going to concentrate on missing persons cases. We don't want to get involved in homicides per se because, as you know, there's all kinds of legal issues, and then all kinds of paperwork that you have to be signed. But if you work in missing persons cases, it's not a a major deal for that, or unidentified human remains. So we're going to be working with the local coroners and everything else that we can do. And this is all in the planning stages. It sounds great on paper, but it's going to be a lot of work to get it done. But
does sound like it,
I'm actually looking
but
forward to it, though.
I think you're the guy to take it on. In the last few minutes I got with you here, we've talked about all of the stuff you've done, but one thing we haven't mentioned is along the way, you also start this YouTube channel.
Yeah.
What inspires you to do that? Because talk about switching gears. I can understand the natural progression from, law enforcement to teaching to now writing a book for the teaching. YouTube, is a whole different animal. What inspired you to do that? And tell us about that journey.
Right. Well, I'll condense that story into a much shorter one. But when I retired, I wanted to do media stuff,
Mm,
and I had set out a plan, how to do this, and I figured the local newspapers would be the easiest place to get interviewed for, or radio, because it's New York City, you have so many radio stations, and then TV. But I had, working in cold case, I got to meet a lot of media people.
mhm.
So, but New York City, very strict on who is allowed to talk to the media. I mean, you are not allowed to talk to the media. There's actually a famous press conference that I was in cold case. We were doing a dig for human remains in a home out in Brooklyn, and the FBI was working with us, and they were holding a presser. And the chief called me up and said, "Yeah, Joe, you're going to be doing this presser today?" I said, "Yep." He goes, "You say one word, and your ass is going to be on the first train out of there. Do not
Wow.
say a word." Yeah, because at the time, Ray Kelly was the police commissioner. He didn't want anybody talking to the media. It was only him. So it was
Gotcha.
like, yeah, we used to call it the Iron Curtain. And so that was my first press. So I just stand there with my arms folded like this, and they asking me putting the microphone in there. I'm just like staring at them. It's actually pretty funny. I had the clip somewhere, but anyway, I digress. So when I retired, I said, "All right, I'm gonna start looking at the local newspapers." Well, within 2 or 3 days, A&E called me and said, "Yeah, well, one of the cases that you worked on, we want you to come in and we want to do." So the first thing I ever did was an A&E show called The Killer Speaks,
Wow.
and then like everything else, the hardest one is your first one, right? So as soon as you get the first one, now everyone thinks you're an expert and they want to talk to you. So and then the floodgates just open up. So I was doing television, I was doing and actually the really the case that kind of put me on the map is we had up in Dannemora prison up in New York State, we had two prisoners escape that had used this female that was working there. So we had all kinds of relationships with her.
Sure.
They made a movie about this, yeah.
Yeah, I
So
remember that.
I find myself now on CNN desk for 2 hours in the morning, every day for like a whole week. I'm like, I'm running the desk, me and one of the other, and I'm just talking for 2 or 3 hours on the desk doing it, and that's what kind of like really put me on the map. So,
Wow.
and then I've done them all, you name it: Fox, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, international stuff. I've been on TV in Japan, uh, Brazil, Italy, Israel. I mean, you name it. So anyway,
Yeah.
it got to a certain point where I started toning it down because it just became like a job.
Yeah.
And and I said, and everyone said, like, why don't you just like have all these guys and doing these YouTube pages? Why don't you do one of those instead and do it for yourself? So I'm like, okay. So and then I just started. I would, try to come up with a name, and I came up with the True Crime with the Sarge name, and and I kind of just launched it, and and I do mostly interviews. I don't do much like the news commentary like I was doing. I mean, I will do it on occasion, uh, but most of the stuff was interviews. So I try to find experts that come in and we talk about a specific topic, and get to know them, kind of like what we're doing here. And it's been pretty well received. And like everything else, from meeting total strangers, and you create these relationships with people, and you end up, your channel ends up growing through these collaborations and everything else, and it's kind of cool because
Yeah.
it's really yeah, a lot of thing about I know, YouTube, a lot of people kind of bash it because there's so many crazy things going on here, but the people that you meet, everybody wants to see everybody do well because the high tide lifts all boats, and
Very
it's
true.
actually kind of fun.
That's very true. I live by those words. You have had one of the busiest retirements of any retired person I think I've heard of. You are got a lot of spinning plates. Is there, before I let you go, is there anything else that you're working on you want people to know about? We've heard about the book and the cold case and potential potentially working with Penn State. Anything else you want to share with people before I let you go?
No, I think I'm just gonna keep on continuing doing the YouTube channel. I might start taking some of those videos, which I've been neglected to do, because you get the audio and then putting them
Yeah.
out on a podcast. I
Yeah.
haven't done that yet, and I'm still learning how to do all these things. So, even though I had to take some time off for family reasons. So, this I think August would be 2 years since I started the channel, but I had to take off about 9 months, and now that I'm back, I'm trying to play catch up, and I'm going to start looking at some of those videos. And I have, Josh, a ton of historic interviews with people who are no longer here. Like, for instance, James Lavelle, who was the detective with the white hat who was holding on to uh, Lee Harvey Oswald when they
Yeah.
walked out. I had
Oh
a
yeah.
phone interview with him. Yeah, I went out to Arizona in 2015, and I found the detective who arrested Ernesto Miranda, Carol Cooley,
Nah,
and I spent a whole day with him in his house. He took me to all the places. So I have all of this material. Now I'm going to start putting these things together because I have a bunch of historic stuff that unfortunately these guys are no longer here, and I think it would make for some great content.
I think so. I can't wait. So, for everybody listening, check out your YouTube channel, True Crime with the Sarge. Is there a website or social media or anywhere else you want to direct people?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you go to True Crime with the Sarge, I have my links there, but it's josephjackalone.com. You can find me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. It's at Joe Giacalone. And, like I said, I'm not that hard to find. If you just Google the name, you can find the hate mail there too, I'm sure. There's always comes with the territory, as you know, Josh. You can't make everyone happy.
It's very true. Well, you've made me extremely happy. I appreciate the time that you took today. You've got a fascinating story. I mean, I could have spent, I think, another couple of hours just talking about all the stuff you must have experienced while you were on the force. But thank you again so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. The pleasure was all mine.
We hope you enjoyed this interview. If there is someone you would like to hear from, a well known creator, or perhaps someone you feel that gets overlooked, please let us know in the comments. And please check out our playlist of past conversations. We appreciate you all. Please remember to like this episode and subscribe for more content like this. And thank you again for joining us for this episode of Courtroom Confidential Conversations.